The bells rang before the sun had burned away the morning mist, their silver voices carrying over the rooftops of Astravan like a promise. Banners of silk, pale blue for the bride, deep green for the groom, unfurled in the breeze, each embroidered with the same entwined crest that had bound their families together for generations. In the palace courtyard, courtiers in jewel-toned velvets arranged themselves like a living tapestry, faces lifted toward the balcony, where Queen Seraphina would appear for the first time as wife to King Aldrich. She stepped into view to a ripple of awe, 17 years old, her porcelain skin catching the light, her auburn hair braided with gold thread, a sapphire girdle encircling her narrow waist. She moved like a figure painted onto glass, careful and slow, as though the wrong step might crack her. Beside her, Aldrich stood straight and unyielding, the emerald velvet of his doublet rich against the fur lining his mantle. Their joined hands rested on the balustrade. To the crowd below they were beauty perfected, the very image of unity. But beauty has its shadows. In the quiet between the bells, the old women in the back of the crowd murmured to one another. The Queen's eyes, they said, were too deep set, her frame too slight. They spoke of uncles who had married nieces, cousins who had wed before their voices had even deepened. They remembered, though no one dared write it down, the infants born with twisted limbs, or the princes who had grown wild-eyed before they were 30. It is in those bloodlines, not in the banners, that this story truly begins. And before we go further, I need you to imagine the weight of a crown, not as gold, but as a curse passed from one head to the next. Because what you're about to hear is not just the story of a queen, it is the story of a dynasty that bred itself into madness. If you believe history hides its darkest truths in the marriages it celebrates, stay with me. You will not forget what follows. Inside the cathedral, the air smelled of beeswax and incense, heavy with heat from the press of bodies. Seraphina's gown trailed behind her like a spill of moonlight, its hem whispering over the worn stones. She didn't look at Aldrich as they walked the aisle, her gaze fixed on the altar, the crown that waited there, the carved figures of saints who seemed to lean forward, curious. Father Corvin, the court confessor, lifted his hands to bless the union, his voice steady, his eyes unreadable. When Aldrich slid the ring onto her finger, Seraphina's lips curved into a smile that was almost convincing. Almost. Elswith, her lady-in-waiting, saw the tremor in her hand, the slight catch in her breath. She had been at Seraphina's side for years. She knew the Queen's composure was a thin veil, and she knew why. In the archives, hidden between volumes of royal chronicles, lie pages no historian dares to quote. Notes of chroniclers who described fits of trembling, melancholia, and the clouded mind that stalked the royal house like an heirloom. There were kings who feared the sun, queens who refused to eat unless served by children, princes who carved strange symbols into the palace doors. Each was bound by the same ancestry. And now, with every vow spoken, with every ribbon tied and goblet raised, Seraphina and Aldrich braided themselves tighter into that same rope, a rope already frayed, already strained, one that would one day snap. The courtiers smiled, the bells rang, the chroniclers sharpened their quills, and somewhere in the crowd's roar there was the faintest echo of laughter that did not belong to joy at all. The first months were a pageant. Morning processions, afternoon audiences, evening banquets, each one another test of how long Queen Seraphina could stand before her body betrayed her. At first, she managed. She smiled at the merchants who brought bolts of rare silk, inclined her head to ambassadors who spoke of treaties, lifted her wine cup when toasts were made in her name. But always, After the applause had faded and the doors had closed, her shoulders would sag, her hands trembling as though she'd been holding them still by sheer force of will. The fainting came in the 3rd week. She was receiving petitioners in the great hall when her vision blurred. The faces before her began to ripple, their words dissolving into a low hum. She reached for the arm of the throne, but her fingers missed, and she felt herself tipping into the darkness. When she woke, she was in her chambers, the heavy velvet curtains drawn. Aldrich was there, standing at the foot of her bed, his arms crossed. He told her she must eat more, sleep more, walk more. His voice clipped, the edge of command sharper than concern. By the 2nd month, nosebleeds left faint red smudges on her handkerchiefs. She learned to tilt her head just so, to keep her hair falling forward during council sessions, hiding the cloth she pressed to her face. Isolde, the Dowager Queen, noticed. She always noticed. Her visits to Seraphina's chambers were polite incursions, bringing trays of spiced broth, speaking softly of the kingdom's needs, her eyes lingering a little too long on the Queen's pallor. She never spoke openly of weakness. She didn't have to. Every compliment was weighted with what was left unsaid. Elswith, her lady-in-waiting, became her shadow. In the corridors she walked a half-step ahead, intercepting questions before they reached Seraphina. At banquets, she adjusted the Queen's goblet so her hand wouldn't tremble when she raised it. She whispered the names of nobles before Seraphina had to greet them, filling the silence that might have revealed how her mind sometimes faltered. Still, the whispers spread. Servants said the Queen's appetite was gone. Courtiers swore they had seen her eyes glaze over mid-conversation. The palace steward remarked too loudly that a Straven's winters could be hard on someone not bred for cold. Seraphina felt the eyes on her even in solitude. She began sitting with her back to the wall, watching the door. She told herself it was caution, not fear, though the two had begun to feel the same. And each time she saw Aldrich, his charm was a little thinner, the warmth in his gaze a little less certain. The crown, when she wore it, felt heavier now, not from gold, but from the weight of what people refused to say in her presence. She understood in some unspoken way that the season of her grace period was ending, and that the court, beautiful and glittering as it seemed, would not forgive a queen whose hands could not hold steady. The palace was never truly silent. At night its vast corridors breathed, wood settling in the walls, wind slipping through the arrow slits, the faint rustle of tapestries as if someone had just passed. Queen Seraphina learned to move through that darkness without a candle. She said the moonlight was enough. It was on those nights that the portrait seemed most alive. Generations of Astravan's rulers stared down at her from gilt frames, kings with hawk-like profiles, queens draped in silks that had long since turned to dust. She paused before them, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, as though confiding in family who might keep her secrets. She called them by name, names no one had spoken aloud in decades. Sometimes she tilted her head, as if listening for their replies. Servants avoided the eastern wing after sunset. Word spread quickly about the laughter, soft at first, then rising in sudden bursts that echoed from behind the locked doors of her private gallery. One footman swore he heard two voices where only the Queen had entered. Another claimed he'd glimpsed her in the long mirror at the end of the corridor, her lips moving though no sound reached his ears. In his study, Lord Bastien de Rouvert kept a separate ledger, its pages bound in plain leather, tucked behind medical treatises. Each entry began the same way: Her Majesty, observed at, followed by the hour and the smallest of details, pacing for exactly 27 steps, pausing at the portrait of Queen Ameline for 3 minutes, humming an unrecognisable tune. He wrote in a coded hand, twisting letters and reversing numbers, so that even if the pages were found, few could read them. Still, each time a door creaked in the corridor outside, he set his quill down and held his breath until the sound passed. By the 3rd month, Seraphina's chair at the council table sat empty more often than not. Officially, it was to preserve her strength. In truth, the meetings went on without her. Policies were debated, treaties amended, royal decrees sealed, all without her knowledge or consent. The first time she realised a decision had been made in her absence, she asked Aldrich why she hadn't been summoned. He told her it was a minor matter, unworthy of her time. The next time, she didn't ask. She began to walk the corridors more often, memorising the rhythm of the guards' footsteps, the timing of the bells. The palace seemed to hold its breath when she passed, the air thicker, as if listening. Even Elswith, loyal as she was, had begun to look away when their eyes met. Her silence weighted with something Seraphina couldn't name. In the flicker of torchlight against ancient faces, in the whisper of her gown over stone, the Queen felt it, the slow turning of the wheel, the quiet shifting of power. Whether it was her mind fraying or the palace itself closing in, she could no longer tell. The shadows spoke either way. The birth began before dawn, a low tide of pain that dragged Queen Seraphina from uneasy dreams. By the time the midwives arrived, her skin was clammy, her braid damp with sweat, her voice reduced to whispers that barely reached the canopy above her bed. The air in her chamber turned thick with the smell of boiled linens and crushed herbs. Candles guttered in their sconces, shadows trembling on the walls like restless witnesses. Hours bled into each other. Each wave of pain was sharper than the last, tearing at her body and her mind until the edges of the room blurred. At one point she thought she heard the portraits calling her name, but when she tried to answer, her voice dissolved into a cry. The midwife's hands pressed hard against her belly. Another voice urged her to push, and for a moment she wondered if she would survive at all. When the child's cry finally broke through the haze, it was thin but steady. They placed Prince Julian in her arms, swaddled in white linen, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the world he'd entered. Seraphina's body felt hollowed out, every breath shallow, but she clung to him as if letting go would mean losing more than she could bear. The bells of Astravan rang before she even knew he'd been taken from her arms. Just to be weighed, someone said. By the time he was returned, Isolde was standing at her bedside, a smile that did not reach her eyes fixed in place. The Dowager Queen cooed over her grandson, her hands lingering too long on the bundle, her voice warm but edged with ownership. She spoke of tutors and wet nurses, of the importance of a strong upbringing, all before Seraphina had even held Julian for the second time. The court celebrated loudly and at length. Banquets filled the great hall for days, musicians played until their fingers ached, poets recited verses comparing the prince to heroes long dead. But in the spaces between the noise, other words spread. Words about the Queen's pallor, her exhaustion, the faint way she held her son as if he might break. Servants repeated the details in kitchens and corridors, how the physician had stayed longer than was usual, how her recovery seemed slower than expected. The word unfit began to slip into conversations, never in her presence, but always close enough for her to feel its shadow. Father Corvin came to her chambers one afternoon while Julian slept in his cradle. His cassock smelled faintly of incense. His hands, folded over the silver cross, didn't move as he spoke. He reminded her of duty, to God, to the crown, to the heir. His voice was calm, but each phrase felt weighted, a caution disguised as blessing. He did not say she was failing, yet the space between his words left no other interpretation. Seraphina began to watch the people around her with new eyes. She noticed how Isolde's visits always coincided with Julian's waking hours, how Aldrich seemed eager to pass the child into his mother's arms, as though it relieved him of some unspoken burden, how Elswith, loyal as ever, hesitated before handing Julian back to her, as though gauging whether it was safe. Her joy, that fierce, aching joy of holding her son, hardened into something sharper. She no longer believed the warmth in the room was meant for her. The circle was closing, and she could feel it in every measured smile, every soft voice that carried a hidden blade. Julian was hers. But in Astravan, nothing stayed yours for long. The Feast of St. Verena drew half the kingdom into Astravan's capital. Streets were swept clean, shop fronts hung with garlands, and the cathedral square shimmered under banners of white and gold. The air was heavy with the smell of incense and trampled herbs, the sound of bells and chanting woven together in a single unbroken thread. Queen Seraphina walked at the heart of the procession, her pale blue gown trailing over the cobblestones, her crown glinting in the afternoon sun. Aldrich strode beside her, one hand raised in blessing to the crowd, the other resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. Behind them came Isolde and the council, then a river of clergy, their vestments bright as stained glass. It happened just as they reached the fountain at the centre of the square. A face in the crowd, she could not later say whose, caught her eye. Lips moved. She felt the words as if they had been whispered directly into her ear. Not a blessing, not praise, a curse, sharp, unmistakable. Her breath caught and the air around her seemed to close in. She stopped walking. The music faltered, the line behind her hesitating. Aldrich turned toward her, confusion flickering across his face. Seraphina's gaze was locked on that patch of crowd. She spoke, too loudly, accusing the shadowed figure of wishing death on her and her child. Her voice rang against the cathedral walls, slicing through the hush that had fallen. The nobles nearest her exchanged quick, searching glances. A scribe lowered his quill, then hastily began to write again. Somewhere in the crowd, someone laughed, and the sound carried. Aldrich took her arm, his grip firm enough to leave a mark. "Enough," he murmured, though the word was meant for her ears alone. She pulled back, eyes wide, as if the curse had followed her into his voice. By the time they returned to the palace, the decision had been made. Seraphina was told she would not leave her chambers until further notice. For her safety, they said. Guards were stationed at her doors, polite but immovable. Meals were brought in on silver trays. The curtains were drawn against the city she could no longer see. In the corridors beyond, the rumours grew that she had been hexed, that she was unwell in mind, that an annulment might be the only way to protect the succession. Elswith still attended her, but something had shifted. She no longer met Seraphina's eyes as often. Her voice was careful, her movements measured, as though every gesture might be misread. The Queen, once the figure at the centre of the kingdom's most splendid ceremonies, had become a shadow behind a locked door, and in Astravan, shadows were rarely remembered for long. They moved her at night. No announcement, no ceremony, only the soft shuffle of guards' boots and the muted thud of trunks against the marble floor. Seraphina followed without speaking, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, the hem of her robe whispering with each step. The corridors they took were unfamiliar, lit only by wall sconces whose flames bent under the draught. The new chambers were large enough, but their grandeur felt hollow. The windows, tall and arched, had been swaddled in heavy velvet drapes so thick no light could pass. The air inside was still, scented faintly of dust and old incense. The door closed with a sound that was too final, and she knew, without being told that she would not open it herself again. At first she tried to write letters to Aldrich, to Isolde, to the council, each sealed with her crest, each given to the guard at her door. None were answered. When she asked after them, the guard said only, "They will be delivered." She stopped asking after the third week. Her visitors thinned to almost nothing. Julian was brought to her in the mornings, carried by a nursemaid who never met her gaze. She would hold him until his small body grew heavy with sleep, his breath warm against her neck, and then they would take him away. The rest of the day was filled with the silent company of attendants who moved like shadows, cleaning, replacing candles, setting down trays of food she barely touched. Beyond her door, the palace lived on. She could hear it in fragments, the distant strains of music during a feast, the swell of voices when the court gathered, the occasional burst of laughter that cut through the night. Sometimes she imagined the life that continued without her, the banquets, the alliances, the celebrations where her absence was not remarked upon. Perhaps it was not even noticed. She began to lose her sense of hours. Without sunlight, time folded in on itself, days bleeding into one another. She would wake not knowing if it was morning or evening, her dreams stitched from the same fabric as her waking thoughts. The room seemed to shrink, each wall pressing closer, each shadow holding its place as if it had nowhere else to go. Elswith came once, slipping in with a tray of tea. She didn't speak much, only smoothed the Queen's hair back from her forehead and lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes held something that looked like pity, but it vanished quickly when the latch clicked again behind her. The velvet curtains never moved. Seraphina stopped wondering what the world beyond them looked like. In this place there was no sky, no weather, no seasons, only the muffled heartbeat of a court that had already learned to live without its queen. They woke her before dawn. No one explained why. The attendants moved with the same quiet precision as those who had brought her to the velvet prison, lifting her from the bed, dressing her in a gown of pale blue silk, combing out her hair until it shone. The crown was waiting on the table, smaller than the one she'd worn on her wedding day, its sapphires dulled by candlelight. The procession was short. 2 guards walked ahead, their boots echoing in the narrow corridor. At the end stood a chamber she had never seen, its walls draped in heavy brocade, its air heavy with the smell of myrrh. Aldrich was already there, wearing the green and gold of state, his expression flat, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. Beside him, Father Corvin waited, silver cross catching the light. She stood before them, and the words of the coronation, the same ancient phrases spoken over kings and queens for centuries, were recited in a voice so low she could barely hear them. The crown was lowered onto her head, its weight familiar and foreign at once. No trumpets, no cheers, no witnesses beyond the few who'd been ordered to attend. It was not a crowning, she thought. It was a sealing. When it was done, Aldrich stepped forward, kissed her cheek as if greeting a distant relative, and left the room without looking back. She followed the guards to her chambers, the crown still on her head. No one came to remove it. 2 days later, the nursemaid found her. She was seated in the high-back chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her head resting against the carved wood. The coronation gown shimmered faintly in the dim light, the crown still tilted slightly where it had been placed. Her skin was cool. No one spoke of the cause. The court's response was swift and measured. Bells tolled, but only for a day. Official proclamations spoke of her peaceful passing and devoted service to the crown. There was no mention of the month she had spent in isolation. no acknowledgement of the whispers that had followed her since her wedding day. Aldrich appeared at the next council meeting in full regalia, his voice steady as he spoke of stability, unity, the future of Astraven. Julian, too young to understand, sat on Isolde's lap, his small frame dwarfed by the miniature doublet sewn for the occasion. His cheeks were pale, his eyelids heavy, but when the herald announced his name, the court applauded. Beyond the palace, the streets filled for the funeral procession. The people saw the gilded carriage, the velvet-draped coffin, the plumes of white feathers on the horses' heads, and believed in the picture it painted, that the dynasty was unbroken, that the crown was untarnished. But behind the stone walls, those who had watched closely knew better. They had seen the tremors in the Queen's hands, the slow dimming of her gaze, the way the corridors themselves had seemed to swallow her. They understood that the crown was not gold alone, but iron and shadow and the weight of centuries of blood bound too tightly together. And now, with Seraphina gone, that weight had shifted, not lifted. The glitter of Astravan's throne still caught the light, but beneath it lay the same slow, patient rot, waiting for the next head it would claim.